if you want. Okay, hello and welcome everybody to the Residency in WASFA SFA workshop for private institutions. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to go ahead and get started. Our presenters today are Gabi from our Student Financial Assistance Division. You probably work with her a lot, especially on WASFA. And then I'm Gail. I work on our Consumer Protection Division on residency. You've probably also potentially worked with me if you've had residency questions. And in today's session, we have muted you all and the chat function has been disabled, but you can ask your questions in the Q&A. And that's going to be monitored by Carla, and we will check in every so often to see if you've had any questions. And if we're unable to answer a question, we will try to follow up with you directly. And finally, this is being recorded and will be shared out with you after the fact. So let's go ahead and get started. So as I mentioned, I work on residency here at WSAC, and today we're talking specifically about how residency intersects with our state aid programs. We're going to talk about making residency decisions briefly, but we're actually going to spend the majority of the time talking about state aid and residency, and then of course residency for WASFA filers. And then when I'm done, Gabi's going to go ahead and share more about the WASFA for you all, more technical stuff. So who makes residency decisions for state aid? At the private institutions, which I'm hoping all of you represent, or at least you're a friend of the private institutions, you are the decision maker around who gets residency. You're using your admissions and financial aid application information to make that decision. And once you've made that decision, our laws are set up in such a way that your school actually has the final say, but we're here to help. At your institutions, if you have people who aren't in financial aid who are giving residency advice, we really encourage everybody who's not in your office or isn't working on residency to forward all those students to your office. We don't want students being given incorrect information and then being disappointed on the back end or after the fact to find out they didn't qualify for aid. So this is just a very quick slide just to remind you that you're the residency decision maker. And as you know, in our public institutions, they have a residency officer since they charge resident tuition, but you don't. So there we are. So the next slide, we're going to talk about what are the different ways that students can qualify for residency. So there's more than 25 ways that students get resident tuition at our public colleges and universities. And you all aren't public, of course, but we use that law, that resident tuition law, to determine who meets residency requirements for our state aid programs. So all 25 plus of those ways, those residency options meet residency requirements for these 4 aid programs: State Work Study, Passport to Careers, the American Indian Endowed Scholarship, and the National Guard Education Grant, which is new. If you have questions about it, check in with us after the fact. But only 5 of them meet the requirements for the Washington College Grant and the College Bound Scholarship. And we're going to focus on these 5 because the Washington College Grant and College Bound are of course, our biggest programs. And we want to make sure that you understand those laws because WCG is now an entitlement for students. So we want to make sure you have everything you need to understand how students can qualify, especially in this webinar, people who are filing the WASFA. So what are those 5 ways? They're actually more like 3 because the first 2 are going to be the ones you're the most familiar with. These are types that deal with domicile. So as I think most of you know, you're financially independent students, which by the way is defined differently from financial aid. We'll talk about that later. They have to have a domicile here for at least a year prior to the quarter they're trying to get residency. for non-educational purposes. The domicile has to be for non-educational purposes. Financially dependent students, it's based on their parents' domicile. And this A, B, C, D, and E are sections of the statute listed. So C, I'm calling it unicorn. You're probably never going to see that. And if you do, you win a prize. D doesn't happen very often, so I'm not really going to touch on it. And E, this is actually new this year. If you hit the forward arrow, Gabi. You may know this already as 1079. You may know this as the Residency Affidavit. You may know this as our tuition equity law. We want to make sure we're calling this the Residency Affidavit because that is what it is. Students are filing a Residency Affidavit to say that they've lived here for a year prior to their first term. And we're going to go into way more detail about that because up until this point, that law actually required students to live here for 3 years before high school graduation. And it has now been changed to make it easier for students, particularly undocumented students, to qualify for residency and therefore meet residency requirements for WCG and all of the other financial aid programs. So let's skip that slide. So the next piece of what we're talking about today is how does residency intersect with the WASFA? So the WASFA is our application for state aid for students who aren't eligible for federal aid and therefore don't fill out the FAFSA. And basically anyone can file the WASFA, but, and Gabi will talk more about that, but in general, the people filing the WASFA are those who aren't eligible for federal aid. And that includes undocumented students with or without DACA, people with temporary protected status, pending asylum, non-immigrant visas. There's also non-citizens who can actually file the FAFSA, and that includes refugees and asylees, for example. So one of the takeaways I hope you walk away with today is to know that non-citizens and undocumented students can absolutely meet our state's residency requirements and can absolutely therefore qualify for aid if they meet the other aid program requirements. The best thing to do would be to have, if you don't exactly know what application a student should file, they can go to the WASFA and it points them to the right application, FAFSA or WASFA, based on their immigration status. But today we're not talking about FAFSA, we're talking about WASFA. And the students who file the WASFA can only meet residency requirements through two options. One is the Residency Affidavit, or E, from that law that I mentioned prior. And we're going to go into way more detail about that and the changes. And if they don't meet E, and in this case, now with this new law, probably the majority of your WASFA filers are actually going to meet E. But if they don't, they have to have a qualifying immigration status, and we'll talk about that as well. I see there's a question. Is it related to the WASFA or what I've talked about so far?
I think you're going to cover it shortly. Will Residency Affidavit 1 year apply to summer quarter 2021?
Well, I will cover that. I'll cover that in the slide after this one. So what is that new law? Currently, this is where we're at right now. The Residency Affidavit requirement through the 24th of July is that the student must get a high school diploma or equivalent here in Washington, and that they have to live here for 3 years prior to earning the diploma or equivalent and then continuously after that until they go to college. And then it's called the Residency Affidavit because they then sign an affidavit saying, yep, this is true. And for those who aren't already citizens or permanent residents, they say, I will apply for US permanent residency when I'm eligible. So that affidavit is open to any student. That's the way the law is written, but the majority of people who utilize this law and this affidavit are going to be undocumented and other non-citizen students. Starting on the 25th of July, we're now in the orange has turned into green. So instead of having to earn that high school diploma in Washington, it can be anywhere in the US. And of course, that includes GED or equivalent. And instead of the 3 years prior to high school diploma, it's 1 year before their first term, that first term of admittance. So So basically you're just looking to see, did this student, the student has to attest that they've lived here for a year. It doesn't have to be a domicile. And the difference there is usually they're the same thing, but sometimes a domicile can be in another state because that's their permanent address. But living simply means that they've basically been physically present here and they've maintained their their housing here. This is where they spend their time. And most of the time living and domicile are the same, but sometimes they're different. So let's go to the next slide because that's going to answer the question that was asked. So you saw that starting July 25th is when this law goes into effect. And what that means is for summer is it's based on when your term starts. So residency decisions have to be made within 30 calendar days of your quarter starting. So if July 25th lands within that 30th day, then you would apply it to summer. If not, you would apply it to fall, or maybe you have a second summer session. So I don't know with the institutions on the call where you're at. My guess is many of you, it probably won't apply until fall. Another question that I'm assuming is going to come up is for continuing students. So if you have students who this last year did not qualify for Washington College Grant or any other financial aid because of their residency, they may be able to for this upcoming academic year if they lived in Washington for a year prior to their first term. So let's say you had a student who started last year, last fall, and prior to that, maybe they lived here for a couple years, but they couldn't meet the old 1079 or the old affidavit because they didn't live here for 3 years before graduating high school. They can now be considered for this new affidavit for this coming fall. It's not retroactive, so you wouldn't go back and give them a Washington College Grant for last year, but they could potentially get it for this coming year. So those are some questions I had anticipated. I know there's a lot of other ones, but are there any questions that come to mind right now? Because this is really, these two slides are where I'm really talking about the new law, and I'm going to talk next about the affidavit a little bit more and what that looks like.
Nothing showing in the chat.
Okay. So let's go to the next slide. So what is the residency affidavit? I'm hoping most of you are familiar with this. It is pretty much on the WASFA, but there is a paper form for people who file the FAFSA because, as I said before, this law is open to any student. It primarily benefits undocumented students because they have no other way of getting residency unless they have DACA. But undocumented students have had this opportunity for quite a while to qualify for aid. And we've embedded the affidavit into the WASFA so that they don't have to do both the electronic WASFA and a paper form. So if your current practice is to have a student fill out both the WASFA and a paper affidavit, we really ask that you have them only do one. And again, it's based on what financial aid application they're using. And the cool part too about the WASFA is that there's a residency report that you can access that tells you who has met the requirements, who said, yep, I've met the requirements and I plan to become a permanent resident when I'm able. And Gabi, that's the majority of what her presentation is going to be about. And so she's the person you want to ask all those WASFA details to. There's no additional documentation you have to ask for. So regardless if you have the paper or the electronic affidavit, if the student says, yep, I meet these, then you don't question that unless you see any red flags. So an example could be that maybe you see on their admission materials that they don't have a Washington address anywhere. Well, how can they say they've lived here for a year if they don't have a Washington address? In that case, you would reach out to the student and ask for documentation to determine what are you? Do you meet this or not? And if they don't, then you're going to have to figure out if they meet residency through any other ways. So I see that there is a question.
What about non-traditional students who have a high school diploma from a non-US school?
Good question. At this time, our guidance is that the high school diploma has to be from the United States or a territory. So we will be sending out a memo about more in depth about this law so that you have something in writing. And we will be talking about that. But at this time, it is a US diploma. Any other questions?
That's all that's in the Q&A.
So next slide, as I mentioned, you may have some WASFA filers who don't meet that affidavit, but as you can imagine, most of your WASFA filers are going to meet the affidavit. They'll have lived here a year before classes start. And I do want to say one more thing, that the affidavit is not, this new law is not going to apply to students who've already been attending, and maybe they came here right as classes started. So let's say classes started in August last year. They moved here in August. They've been attending ever since. They've technically lived here a year before their second year, but they didn't live here a year before that first term they were admitted. So it's all about the admittance term, not the term that they're trying to get residency for. So I hope that makes sense. So back to WASFA filers who don't meet the residency affidavit. We aren't imagining there's going to be many of them, but if they are, they have to have a qualifying immigration status. They either have to have DACA, current or expired, or an employment authorization document, which is a work permit. And if they have one of those or one of these others, they then just go through the same residency process you would do for your other students that you review. And that's mostly going to be the domicile, the A and B, if you remember that from the few slides ago, which if you go to the next slide, I can talk about a little bit more. So if they have one of those qualifying immigration statuses, and our website, our residency website, which I put on the first slide, and you'll be getting this, so you'll have that website, it actually helps you know which immigration statuses are qualifying. But most of the students, if they have that qualifying immigration status, they're going to have to get residency through A or B. They're either independent, who've had a domicile here for a year for purposes other than education, or they're dependent and one of their parents has had that domicile. And another thing I want you to remember is that almost anyone can establish a Washington domicile. The only people who really can't are those who have a certain kind of visa that requires domicile elsewhere, which in general are going to be student or tourist visas. So F visas and B visas. In general, those folks can't really establish a Washington domicile, but undocumented folks can, a lot of non-citizen folks can. So just wanted to make sure you're aware of that. If you go to the next slide, the other thing, I said this very quickly early on, is that financial independence, the definition for residency is different than the one you are very accustomed to, but usually they're going to align. Our definition, residency's definition, is that financially independent students are ones who are not claimed on taxes and did not receive significant financial assistance in the previous and current calendar years. So those in general are going to align. That law is going to generally align with FAFSA because most of your students who are under 24 are claimed on taxes, are getting significant financial assistance, but there are cases like what I've listed here. Maybe you have a 20-year-old who's not claimed on taxes and they have been paying their way. That student is actually financially independent. Or you might have a married student who, for financial aid purposes, is independent, but under residency purposes is not because their parent is paying their way. So most of the time, those aren't going to pop up. But just be aware that they're not exactly the same, but they usually align. And with this new law, my guess is a lot of your people who've been here for a year, as long as it's a year before admittance, they may be meeting that new law and would get residency that way. And then you don't even have to think about domicile or dependence or independence. And if we go to the next slide, this is that's basically it that I have for you. And these were the main takeaways that I hope that you walk away with. And I think the primary one is that I want you all to understand that I think you're all aware that our laws have been very supportive of undocumented students, but they're also supportive of other students who aren't citizens, refugees, people who've applied for asylum, all sorts of different visa types. And so we really hope that you encourage all of your students to file whatever financial aid application works for them. Send them to the WASFA. It will tell them which application is open to them. And then you will know, especially with the WASFA, if they've signed the affidavit, you'll see, great, they meet residency requirements for aid. And it would be for all aid if they meet the affidavit requirements. We think most of your WASFA filers are going to be meeting residency through the residency affidavit, so you don't have to even figure out what their immigration status is to figure out if they meet that outside of WASFA, or sorry, outside of the affidavit. 725 is when this starts, and I can answer questions about that if there's any confusion. And then we want students only filing one affidavit, paper or WASFA. Most of your folks are going to be filing it through the WASFA. And then of course, we're here to help because we know that residency is not your number one thing that you focus on. And I really want to make sure that you understand. And like I said, if there's one thing you take away from this, it's that pretty much almost there's more non-citizens than not who can get residency and therefore get Washington College grant if they meet the financial requirements. So that's all I had to share with you. If there's not any questions, we can go ahead and move on to everything you want to know about WASFA.
So Gabi, it's all yours.
Thank you. Can you folks all hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you for the thumbs up. All right, so today we're going to go over what the WASFA is, quick awarding guidance, and then we're going to look at how to access the WASFA and the residency affidavit that Gail had mentioned in her section. So the WASFA is the state aid application for financial aid. It is for those who are unable to file the FAFSA due to immigration status or U.S. citizenship, somebody who's a U.S. citizen whose parents are undocumented and choose not to do a FAFSA, they can do it, or those who have defaulted loans or in repayment or have a rejected FAFSA. They are all able to do the WASFA. We do recommend that if they are not rejected for the FAFSA, they continue to use the FAFSA and not complete a WASFA. Many times people think that if they don't get financial aid because they did the FAFSA, that if they do the WASFA, it will change their award status, which does not. So the colleges are going to use the WASFA to determine any eligibility for state aid programs and any institutional need-based aid programs. So like the FAFSA, students complete a new application each year. The newest application opens on October 1 of each year. We have 2 years running simultaneously. And the new website that students will be able to access, and they can already, at wasac.wa.gov/WASFA. We're moving away from the Ready, Set, Grad pages, so we are trying to get everybody used to going to the WASAC pages. However, the application currently is still linking on the Ready, Set, Grad page, so that is still where they get the application. And it will automatically direct students and anybody who's trying to access those when we do totally move away from Ready, Set, Grad. And most importantly, WASAC is very committed to protecting the confidentiality of students. So we do have the WASFA privacy statement is listed on the page where they access the WASFA. It's also before they go into the WASFA application itself. All data collected on the WASFA can only be used for the sole purpose of determining eligibility for state financial aid programs, should not be given out to any researchers or any other folks. And again, the privacy statement is available on the registration page. Do we have any questions so far?
Can students complete a WASFA after June 30th, the FAFSA deadline?
After the June 30th, it will close, but it does automatically shut down, so they will not be able to do that year. So we do run parallel to the FAFSA.
That's
Right.
the only question.
Thank you. Okay, so to get an idea about how many WASFAs we get each year, the applicant counts have been going up since 2017. The current year, we only have the 6 months numbers so far. But as you see, we have the 2021 WASFA is open in addition to the 21-22. And currently for the 6 months for the 21-22, we're already up to over 3,000. And it's a little bit less at the 6-month point for the 2020. Although we are getting pretty close. Well, I think since the 2021 opened, we are closer to about 5,500 applications for that year. So we're already more than what we had in the 2019 full cycle. So quickly, we're going to go over some awarding guidance. So funding for students who completed a WASFA. All students who meet eligibility and have need must be awarded Washington College grant. Since it did become an entitlement, that is the first source of funding the students should be granted. Those with college bound, who are eligible for college bound, also should be awarded college bound if they still have need after the Washington College grant and all other state need programs. As I mentioned earlier, the WASFA does run parallel to the FAFSA, so we want to make sure that we are awarding our students equitably, that they all have an equitable opportunity. So we want you to consider each WASFA filer in the same way that you consider your FAFSA students, and giving them the same award, utilizing the same processing when you do your awarding. There's no difference for those students. Students who are applying with the WASFA should be verified in the similar manner to which you would do the FAFSA filers. Only difference is that with the WASFA, we don't have an automatic system to alert you to do any verifications such as the FAFSA does. So we do ask that you do verifications of your WASFA students if you are finding any inconsistencies in their applications. So please do verifications. You are allowed to do those, and we do want you to. And also, the WASFA students are not required to file the income taxes, federal income taxes. And so you would not ask them to if they haven't. You would just go ahead and evaluate them in the same way you would any non-tax filer. All right, so because you are private institutions, you get to play both roles, the residency officer and the financial aid officers. So you get to determine all of the program eligibility requirements, along with ensuring that the residency statuses are correct as well. If you find any conflicting information from the WASFA and looking at the affidavit information, then we ask you to work directly with the student to make sure that this information is resolved. Any conflicting information is resolved. You have any questions so far?
No questions.
Okay. So residency information is available in the WSAC portal in the WASFA interface. You can download it in a CSV file or in an ISER file. We'll review in this next section how you can review your WASFA filers to check to see if they're affected by the new 21-22 residency changes. All right, so as a financial aid office, you should have, or you would have access to the WASFA if your institutional administrator has given that to you. In most of the financial aid offices, that person is the financial aid director. So if you require that access, please work directly with your financial aid director or your institutional administrator, and they'll be able to provide you with that. And as Victor had mentioned, if you were in the earlier session today, they do have a new permission for WASFA. It's very exciting. We've been wanting this for years now, is the permission to grant specific people the ability to make corrections directly in the portal to the students' WASPA applications. So be on the lookout for those. Those will be up sometime this week. And the information is loaded into the WSAC portal the day after the student completes their WASFA. So it takes overnight to go through the process and to our system, so you can usually see it within 24 hours. And you will only be able to see the WASFA applications if the student added your school to their application. So if they tell you that they did do an application and you're not seeing it, most likely they'll have to go back in and put their your school on their application, and then you'll be able to see it. Okay, so Gail did mention all the changes coming up, very exciting. So the 2021-22 WASFA is currently open and has been for a while. So these students are going to need to be manually reviewed for their eligibility for residency. The 22-23 WASFA, we will have the residency language updated. We're trying to ask to see if we can get the 21-22 updated. However, you'll still need to manually review them. And since the application has been open for such a long period of time, it might not be feasible. So I will go ahead and skip this slide. If you haven't been into the WASFA interface, this is what it is. It looks from the WASAC portal. You'll be able to search your applicants for your school only. Right? There's many different ways to be able to search. There is the residency data only field, and that is where you can get the residency report or the residency affidavit information that Gail had mentioned previously. All right, so when you complete the information, when you search for your student, on the previous screen, it did show that you can do transaction dates. So you can go pull your students by a certain date range if you know that at a certain day is when you want to start reviewing them, which does not show on this screen, but it is possible. When you request just the residency data information, it'll show up on your screen like it's showing on the bottom of the sample. Now, if you click on the download document, it's going to come up in an Excel format. So just be aware that the ones that I highlight in yellow are the ones that you'll be using. The report actually has more information on it that you won't need to really look at. This columns that I crossed out and are grayed out, those are actually fields that were from the old WASFA. And so we're asking that they might be, if we can get those hidden so it doesn't kind of jam up your data. But you can just hide those and not look at them at all. I'm going to attempt to see if I can share my Excel spreadsheet. I'm hoping it works, but it didn't work on the last one. So And it doesn't look like it wants to work for me today on this one either. I apologize. When you are going to be reviewing your students to find out if they might meet this new residency qualifications, you'll just go across the different columns. So you can search under, you can filter the different categories and see which students you want to review. So you'll be able to see if they didn't have a state of legal residence in Washington, those would be students you probably don't need to review. The affidavit is, I believe it still says the 1079 at the top. Those are the ones that met the 3-year, the old requirement. That will be changing to not read House Bill 1079. However, if you would like me to sit with you, work with you online, I can do that to go over the spreadsheet and help sort through how you would identify the students who need to be reevaluated. Just please go ahead and send me an email to the WCG. We can set up a time through Zoom or Teams or on the phone, however you would like. I'm more than happy to sit with you to help you go through those student lists so that we make sure that everybody is counted for correctly. All right, so do we have any questions for either myself or Gail?
I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A, but we can give it a minute and see if people hop on with questions.
Okay, in the meantime, our contact information is listed here. We do ask that if you have any questions regarding financial aid as an administrator, financial aid administrator, you go ahead and email us at the wcg@wasac.wa.gov email. And we just ask that because we have multiple people who work in that email and help directly with financial aid administrators. If you email any of the other emails addresses that we have, you'll certainly be helped. It's just that we have more, those are more geared towards the students. So we have other people checking those emails that work more with students than they do financial aid administrators. But regardless of where you email, you will get helped. If you email us any residency questions in the WCG, we usually end up reaching out to Gail for help on that because she is the expert, and we all know that residency can be kind of crazy sometimes. So please do not hesitate to contact us, and we will all be happy to help you answer any questions.
I also, I think I forgot to add that the new paper affidavit, I'm hoping will be ready in the next couple weeks. So you can start giving that to students who are filing the FAFSA. And at the top of the affidavit, it actually tells a student whether or not they should be using the paper or WASFA version of the affidavit. And then the other thing, you know, we talked about WASFA a lot, but I do want to remind you that some of your FAFSA filers might qualify under this new law. Or some of your students who, from last year may not have qualified for the WCG, but now can. And so I'm hoping you can come up with in your institution some kind of way to reach out to those FAFSA filers who may not have qualified for residency for financial aid, but maybe could this year. My guess is you could do a similar thing that you would do for WASFA, where you would look in the FAFSA data and look at if anyone was a Washington resident at the time of filing the 2021 FAFSA, or actually even the 21-22 FAFSA as well, and have some kind of mechanism by which you could filter through those folks and maybe reach out to them to say, hey, there's this new law. You may qualify. If you do, please fill out this paper affidavit. So just want to make sure gets out to you all.
And there is a question related to the paper affidavit. Are we able to collect the paper affidavit electronically?
So the way the form is written now is it says it has to be like physically delivered, I think with like a wet signature, but I'm actually going to look into that. It's a fillable PDF at the moment, but I'll look into that a little bit more. I think if your institution has its own process for handling the paper affidavits, and if you prefer to have it electronic, that's up to you. But in the meantime, I'll try to look into that a little bit more, and we'll be sharing that out when the affidavit's ready.
No additional questions.
Well, with that, I think we're good. Thank you all for joining us, and I'm sure there's going to be questions that come up after you let this percolate for a while, so do not hesitate to email us and we'll be happy to help.
Thank you, everybody. And thank you for all the hard work you put in serving our students every day. We appreciate that.